Today I sat down with Sheriff McNeil seeking re-election for his office. Please watch this video and listen to his passion for public service. It was my pleasure to endorse him today. Remember to vote August 18th. Sheriff, welcome. I'm here today with Leon County Sheriff Walt McNeil, and thrilled to be able to announce my endorsement of your campaign.
Thank you.
I'm such
Thank
a great
you.
supporter of
Really
yours, as
appreciate
you know, and in all transparency serve on your campaign fundraising efforts. So please go out and vote for Sheriff McNeil August 18th.
August 18th.
I'm always so impressed with your leadership. You are a leader in law enforcement, but you're also a leader in the community. You and I, having served on a lot of community boards together, and I recall when you were the police chief in the city of Tallahassee is when I first met you. That sense of public service, if I could just get to the core of who you are, why? Why do you do it?
I tell people it's a really complicated maturation of things in my life that led me to where I am today. Most people don't know why I chose the profession that I chose to be in law enforcement. And it stems from an encounter with law enforcement at the age of 12. That was not a very good encounter. I was being integrated from an all-black school to a white school. The police came on the bus with billy clubs and mace and just ran all of us out of the bus. And a few days after that, I had the opportunity to speak to the black officer who policed our community, because black officers at that point in time could only police in the African-American part of our country, quite honestly. And I asked him, why, as a 12-year-old, I was going, the law changed and said we can now integrate schools, so why would the police not allow us to do what's legal? And I'll never forget his response. He said to me, young man, one day, maybe you and your generation can change that, but for right now, that's just the way it is. And I walked away from that feeling sorry for the police officer that he'd obviously given up, but I was also buoyed up by he was saying, well, you need to, when you grow up, do something about it if you can. From 12 years old until even today, my passion has been, how do we improve law enforcement? And I've been doing that, or trying to do that, at every step of the way. I think the hallmarks of my time at the Tallahassee Police Department was the creation of the civil citation program that sought to keep kids from going deeper into the criminal justice system. Instead of arresting kids, like when I was a kid, I'll never forget Miss Mamie, who was my next door neighbor, and I had climbed over her fence and was stealing pomegranates from her tree, and she caught me and she helped me there, and she actually put the chain she had that latched her door to her fence, she wrapped it around me and called my mom. And she and my mom talked about it, and mom said, don't worry, he will not do this again. And so nobody called the police. We resolved it in the community. I got a beating when I got home.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I always look back at that and went, why do we arrest our kids? I mean, we all will do something stupid as a child. As a young adult, you're going to do something stupid somewhere along the way. And so, again, we created that civil citation program, which said for misdemeanor type crimes, first, second offense, let's see if we can't work those out with the family and the victim. And that's a program right now that's used all over across America. Started right here in the Tallahassee Police Department. And that's just an example of what fortifies me and what drives me. The same thing when I went to the Department of Corrections was just seeing the number of African Americans going in and out of prison. When I walked in the door of the Department of Corrections, to find out that, I forget the exact number, but it was mind-boggling. The recidivism rate, I mean, it was something close to 60-70% of persons who leave prison are coming back. If you take out all of the races and say, African Americans, it's even higher than that. And so one of the first things I embarked upon, how do we change this process? How do we make this thing different? And we created then, because I never take credit for it, I'm very fortunate that I often get a lot of good staff that work with me. Staff and we created the first reentry initiative here in the state of Florida. And in 2 years, I'm proud of those folks and the work they did. 2 years, we reduced the recidivism rate by 5%. And that's significant in the state of Florida when you talk about 100,000 people incarcerated. That's a big deal. Those have been my passions. I also, as the president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, realized that wrongful convictions, which was another thing I found when I worked in the Department of Corrections, is that we had so many people who were there who were wrongly convicted. They did not actually commit the crime. And one of the things that caused that reality was the way that we in law enforcement went about identifying suspects. I don't know if you remember, but back in the day, you had one photo, you bring it into the victim and say, is this the person? Well, what else are they going to say other than, yeah, that's him. You brought it in. You must know that that's the guy. And then we got a little bit better about it. And we said, okay, here's 5 or 6 photos. Which one do you think is the person? Patting the picture.
The one you think it is.
Yes. Yeah. And so when I became the president of the IACP, we went about changing that whole process, making sure that nationwide we had processes in place that would be professional. And we came up with double blind so that the person who's actually doing the photo array has no idea who the person is that they believe committed the crime. They're not involved in the investigation at all. And we changed that process. And again, constantly trying to improve the way we do law enforcement, the way we police in our communities.
Do you find that because you are a black sheriff, there's more pressure on you from the community to champion the cause?
There was always a subtle amount of pressure from both communities. Obviously, the African American community has a great hope with me in place that I will change, and sometimes they'd like to see those changes take place overnight, which, I sit down and say, there's only a limit to what the sheriff can do. For example, the issue of investigating the police department. Well, by state statute, that can't happen.
Right.
Now, and I try to explain that, there's a limit to what I can do. Even as a constitutional officer, I can't supersede what the state constitution allows us to do. Now, on the other hand, there's also the pejorative community that believes that, Sheriff, we don't care what color you are, you gotta be colorblind, you gotta just deal with these issues. And that's also wrong. I don't think any of us are colorblind. I don't expect people to. I hope you look at me and say, hey, that's an African-American man, and he has different cultural perspectives, and I want to honor those. And I think it's important that we see each other as who we are. So walking in both worlds, if you will, I have to make sure that I understand what the laws are, and that I be able to articulate those to each community in a way that doesn't give anybody the impression that somehow some group is going to be disadvantaged because I am where I am. And also, it allows me, quite honestly, to see the bigger picture, perhaps better than most can see it, and then I can articulate, I hope I've been able to articulate across the spectrum in terms of how we need to police, what changes need to take place. These changes aren't driven, from my perspective, I was doing this long before Black Lives Matter came along. So these are basically, and I say what President Obama said, in pursuit of a more perfect union is what he said, and I always say, in the pursuit of a more perfect criminal justice system. That means we have to continuously work to improve what we do. And some people don't want to see that. Some people, even people I work with over the years, you don't like change. People, I get in my sort of niche, and I know what to do in that niche, and you're coming around making changes, it makes life more difficult for me. But anybody who's worked with me knows that that's the one thing that's a constant. We're going to continuously improve everything we do. In the Leon County Sheriff's Office, for example, I talk about all the time, we will be a world-class organization. And the question then becomes, well, how do we measure that? And I said, we measure that against what's happening in the world. What the best practices taking place, for example, in Norway. They have a system where police officers are delineated between those police officers who work as social workers and those police officers who work in crime. And it works extremely well in Norway. So I've asked my staff, let's look at what they do. Let's figure out exactly how they do that. And I've been talking about the mental health problem we have here. In Norway, again, they don't send police officers to deal with person with mental health. They send those social service organizations that are embedded with their law enforcement component because they're more able to professionally deal with those issues as opposed to police officers. The problem we've had, I believe, in our country is, and that's why I embrace something called 21st century policing. We're still policing like we did back in the 1950s to some extent. And now technology's changed and all that, but the core things that we try to do, you could probably still step in if you were a police officer in 1950. You have to learn the technology, that kind of thing, and do the same job that we do today. And I don't believe that's where we need to be. I think 21st century policing says that we've got to look at this completely different. And the 20th century model, quite honestly, is based on the military component of local policing. And that's the piece that we've got to try to work our way away from, is the military model. Even our structure, our delineation of departments and all that are based on the military model. And that's something we're working on trying to change.
Sheriff, as I shared with you earlier, I watched a little bit of the meeting you and the police chief had with some of the protesters after the George Floyd death. And I remember one of the protesters really focusing on, we need you to understand our culture. We need you to understand in your training the cultural differences, the communication differences. And how do you respond to that? I didn't feel like you had a chance to respond to that question.
Well, at first, I thought it was a great question, and it's one that needs to be answered. And we in law enforcement all across our country must do a better job of. We started probably 10 years ago with a focus on implicit bias. First, there has to be a realization that police officers and all of us come to, which is we have our biases, and we bring those biases to the workplace. Whether we intentionally bring them or not, they come with us. And until you actually acknowledge that you've got a problem or you have a bias, then you're not going to deal with the bias. And that's one of the things we've kicked off in the Lane County Sheriff's Office, is on an annual basis to do the implicit bias training. I will tell you that is difficult. It is difficult for people to sit down, and it makes people uncomfortable to sit there and talk about biases, because we all want to believe that we don't have them. And it's a conversation that deputies have to have. And sometimes it's just trying to get people to understand that, particularly with African Americans, that culturally we do things differently, and which may appear to be aggressive towards you is really isn't aggressive like I do. I talk my hands a good bit. And so we're trying to make sure we carry that over, that training over, so that it applies in the field. I think the thing we have to do, I believe, Lila, is bring communities together to have those bigger conversations with law enforcement, so that we do this with law enforcement in a silo. And what I'm trying to do, I hope if I'm reelected, is to bring in some folks who really understand these things better than I do, and sit down. And I know there'll be pushback from law enforcement. There always is, primarily because their perspective is, or our perspective is sometimes, that we're being picked up on. It's like the situation in Minneapolis. That happened in Minneapolis. You talk to deputies and officers, you're like, we didn't have anything to do with that. We would never do anything like that here. So why are we being cast in the same light? And that's true, but sometimes we miss the bigger point, which is, unless we change some of the undergirding types of behaviors we have, it can manifest itself in our community as well. And we have to realize and understand that there are just some people that got into this profession, quite honestly, because they felt like this is a place that I can go and be powerful. Not they came in to hurt anybody, but the power of the badge and uniform gives them that authority, and there are people that have that. And that's why, Lila, it's so important along these same lines that we're talking about, that we do as much psychological evaluations, as many psychological evaluations as we possibly can on the front end with respect to people we're hiring, and then as they progress throughout their career, so that we get a snapshot who that person is. I am not the same young man I was when I started in 1979. I've changed quite a bit, and hopefully it's for the good, but people change, and they get a little bit jaded depending on the circumstances they find themselves in our community. And we hope that this type of training, implicit bias training, de-escalation training, will help. And the de-escalation, I think, goes hand in hand with the question the young lady was talking about. How do we, when we're responding to a person who's in their car, who is speaking with their hands, speaking with a lot of voice, full throat, and what's the deputy or officer supposed to do in that circumstance? If they've gone through that training, implicit bias training and de-escalation training, they will already have faced those circumstances, so they're a lot better informed in how to respond. And that's why scenario
Simulation, is it simulation training?
That's right.
Sheriff, for the ideas that you have and the things that you want to do you feel like you have to have the City of Tallahassee Police Department on the same page with you so that you ensure success for the entire county?
Yeah, Lila, that is absolutely essential. We're going to be able to change the culture and improve the culture of policing, not only here but across the country. I think we have the opportunity here in Leon County to be a model for the entire nation. We have some of the most educated people in the state right here in Tallahassee, one of the most informed communities, a community that's engaged, a community that cares. And for the Leon County Sheriff's Office and TPD, I can tell you we've already started that process. I mentioned the Police Athletic League. We had a meeting, myself and Chief Revel this week, along with Chief Brown at FSU, Chief Calloway at FAMU, and we talked about how do we make sure that our policies mirror each other, so that one behavior in one agency, the expectation of a deputy, expectation of an officer, are consistent. The community shouldn't have to look at one policy and say, well, that one's different, so in the city we ought to behave this way, in the county we behave that way. We're too closely connected a community to have those differences in our policies. So
what do you wish I asked you?
I wish you'd ask me, what will you do in this next term as sheriff? And answer your question. We're going to continue to fight the crime problems we've got. I'm happy to say that we dropped our crime rate by 32% over the 3 years I've been sheriff. We will continue to do what I call 21st century policing, which is to embrace transparency at every level of the sheriff's office. We're going to work with our policies and procedures to improve those policies to the point where that advisory council we talked about will be we will change some of their focus to focus on what I believe the most highly visible concerns our community has, which is use of force, and what our policies say, and then how we deal with the future of law enforcement. Can we get better procedures and policies out there in our community? We're going to partner with our social service organizations like we've never done before.
So, but the moral of that answer is your work here is not done, and you have a plan for the next 4 years. What do you want the legacy to be? What do you want Walt McNeil's legacy to be, Sheriff?
It's really simple to me. I just tried to help somebody. That's at the end of the day, all I'm trying to do is to help. And I guess if you wanted to make it a broader response, that I tried to improve the criminal justice system, not only in our state, but across this country. We can do better. And so I hope that when I stop doing this, that I help to improve our system.